In 1942, at the height of his fame as one of Hollywood's best-paid cowboy actors, Gene Autry made an unexpected choice. He walked away from the glittering film world and joined the military. Although he earned hundreds of thousands of dollars each year and could have stayed safely surrounded by praise and admiration, he gave it all up for a small army wage and the constant dangers of flying combat missions. This was not the act of a fading celebrity looking for a new type of attention. Instead, it was the decision of a man determined to prove that behind the cowboy hat, the soft voice, and the friendly smile stood someone who truly knew how to endure, how to sacrifice, and how to walk into a storm instead of watching it pass from far away. Gene Autry was not simply the singing cowboy. He represented the American dream built from dirt, poverty, and exhausting work that tore the skin from his hands. He rose from a boy who saved exactly $8 to buy his first guitar, becoming a legend on radio, film, and television, and eventually turning into a media tycoon and the owner of a baseball team. He made an entire nation believe in the image of a good, kind-hearted cowboy who never fell. But behind that image lay a life that was far from easy. There was a fragile family life, a career threatened more than once, private emptiness that could never be filled, and a large empire that ultimately had no children to inherit it. Gene Autry was the kind of legend who becomes more painful the closer you look. He sang about the West as a land of honor and peace, yet his own life was marked by repeated struggles just to avoid being left behind. So, who was the man who built an empire from his voice and his discipline? Was he truly America's dream cowboy, or a lonely figure who used fame to hide cracks that never really healed? If you could have imagined that behind that decision to walk away from the top lay a childhood that offered no room for choice. Gene Autry was born on September 29, 1907, on a small rented farm near Tioga, Texas. This was a place where life was measured not by dreams, but by how many days a family could keep hold of a land. His father, Delbert Autry, was a horse trader always chasing uncertain deals, sometimes with money and sometimes with nothing, and he was often absent from home. His mother, Elnora, carried a long-standing weakness that cast a heavy silence over the household. With no stable foundation to rely on, the family moved repeatedly between Texas and Oklahoma. Each departure was another forced beginning from almost nothing. From a young age, Gene understood that his childhood would not come with the privilege of waiting. While other children were allowed to grow up slowly, he became used to doing whatever he could to earn a few coins. This included working in the fields, baling hay under the burning sun, and taking odd jobs like shining shoes or sweeping floors. There was no single turning point that changed his life. It was the repetition of hardship that both wore him down and strengthened him day after day. Amid all that instability, music did not appear as a distant luxury, but as the only thing that could not be taken away. Church hymns, his mother's voice echoing in their cramped home, and the strict guidance of his preacher grandfather created a clear system of values: right and wrong, endurance and surrender. Gene was not taught to become famous. He was taught to endure. Within that quiet discipline, his first guitar, bought with $8 saved from sweat and labor, was not merely an instrument. It was the first thing he could truly call his own. The nights he spent working at the train station, where he learned telegraphy, brought no stage lights or applause. There was only the long stretch of silence, exhausting shifts, and a guitar to keep himself from falling into emptiness. He did not sing for others to hear. He sang to survive. From those seemingly anonymous moments, another path began to take shape. It was slow and unclear at first, but clear enough to make it impossible for him to return to his old life even once more. The long nights at the train station did more than teach Gene Autry to endure. They unknowingly placed him in exactly the kind of space where an opportunity could appear at any moment. In the stillness of late-night shifts, he kept playing his guitar and kept singing as a kind of survival reflex. There was no stage, no audience, just the sound of strings and the empty air. Then, on one rare occasion, someone stopped to listen. The story of Will Rogers emerges from that moment, told in different versions. But one detail never changes. For the first time in his life, Gene's voice was no longer just a way to get through loneliness. It was recognized as something that might carry him beyond it. That realization did not arrive like a beautiful dream, but as a disruption. Because to move forward, he would have to leave behind the only thing he could firmly hold onto, a stable job. He tried to do exactly that in 1928 when he decided to go to New York. The city did not wait for him, nor did it make space for a young man from the countryside with a guitar and an unknown voice. There were no contracts, no clear opportunities. Money quickly ran out, and the silence of the music market at the time was cold enough to extinguish any illusion. He returned to Oklahoma, not in triumph, but as someone who clearly understood he had just lost. Yet one thing did not change. He did not leave music behind. Back to small performances, dance nights, and local programs, Gene began appearing on the radio in Tulsa at KVO. There he was introduced by a simple but evocative name, the yodeling cowboy. The image was still rough, not yet fully formed, but it already contained everything. He was a working man who could sing, a voice carrying the dust of the West, and an authenticity that the public of that time was missing. The broadcast did not turn him into a star overnight, but they created something more important. Audiences began to remember him. In 1929, his first recordings appeared. They did not explode into instant success, nor did they transform his life overnight, but they proved that Gene had crossed the boundary of a local performer. He began to exist within a larger system where a name could be recorded, replayed, and spread beyond scattered small venues. At the same time, this phase also increased the pressure because once someone has stepped one foot through the door, turning back becomes far more difficult. From that point on, he no longer acted in the conventional sense. He appeared on screen as the very person audiences already knew from the radio. A singing cowboy who entered troubled towns and did not need excessive gunfire to resolve conflict. At a time when America was exhausted by economic crisis and spreading instability, that image offered a rare sense of safety. People did not come to Gene to watch a confrontation. They came to see that things could be resolved without pushing everything to a brutal limit. What made Gene different was not that he avoided violence, but that he convinced audiences it was enough. While many other cowboys were built on strength and intimidation, Gene relied on personal credibility, his voice, and a clear value system formed early in life. His characters were almost without darkness, a choice that seemed simple yet was exactly what the public needed most at the time. His films were therefore not confined to theaters. They entered homes, were watched by children, and retold as simple stories about right and wrong. Amid all the lights and relentless filming schedules, the pressure never disappeared. Maintaining a flawless image while working at an almost nonstop pace turned each role into a controlled repetition. Never allowed to go too far, yet never allowed to become lifelessly repetitive. Within that fragile balance, Gene Autry did not just exist in Hollywood. He began to take hold of it, one role at a time, one song at a time, until his name was no longer tied to a specific film, but became the very genre he stood within. As that image took root in the public memory, the machinery behind it did not slow. It accelerated to a pace that left almost no room to pause. From 1934 to 1953, Gene Autry appeared in approximately 93 feature films. This number not only astonishes in volume, but reveals how deeply he was pulled into a rhythm of work that allowed no mistakes. The filming schedules were dense. Scripts followed one after another, and each film had to preserve the very spirit that audiences loved. No deviation, no loss of familiarity. On the outside, it was reliable consistency. On the inside, it was the pressure to repeat himself without becoming outdated. Not every role brought new emotion, but every appearance required him to make audiences believe they were meeting the person they needed. In that world, Gene did not stand alone. His horse, Champion, appeared as an extension of himself. Not just a companion, but a visual symbol inseparable from the image of the singing cowboy. Children recognized Champion almost as quickly as they recognized Gene himself. Stories on screen began to spill beyond the theater. Comic books, toys, and merchandise formed a system in which Gene Autry was no longer a single individual, but a name capable of existing across multiple formats at once. A brand emerged not from a carefully planned strategy at the beginning, but from the public's unwillingness to let go of that image. Music never left him. It continued to run alongside everything as an undercurrent, sustaining the entire persona. Back in the Saddle Again was released in 1939, carrying within it the spirit of returning, not after a single specific failure, but after countless times of having to start over in life. The melody was not complex, the lyrics not elaborate, yet it touched exactly the feeling Gene had carried since his earliest days. No matter how many times he was pushed off course, he would return, still holding his rhythm. That song gradually became a signature, like a promise repeated each time he appeared. Before it was "That Silver-Haired Daddy of Mine," and later came "Here Comes Santa Claus," then "Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer," and "Peter Cottontail." Each song opened a different space, yet all retained the simple vocal quality that made listeners feel close to him. Music allowed him to endure through seasons and through generations, even when the screen was no longer the center. That distance was not only measured in money, it was measured in the feeling of being separated from the very image he had built. While he wore a uniform, theaters continued to operate. Old films were still being screened, and audiences still needed a singing cowboy. Only the person standing in that place was no longer him. Republic Pictures did not allow that gap to remain. Leonard Sly was elevated, reshaped, and quickly became Roy Rogers. A new name, a new face, yet carrying very familiar elements. Cowboy music and a clean, approachable image. It was not because Gene had been replaced, but because the system had learned how to create another Gene Autry. It happened so quickly that it left almost no pause, as if the audience never had time to realize that a transition was taking place somewhere else without cameras or lights. Yet Gene Autry continued his work, flying, moving, following orders, and living within a rhythm completely unrelated to fame. No one called him a star. No one waited for him to sing. No one cared where he had once stood. The silence now was not like the nights at the train station long ago, when he was an unknown man trying to find a way out. This was the silence of someone who had once been at the center and now had to accept standing on the sidelines while that world continued to turn, continued to produce, continued to replace, and continued to move forward without needing to wait for him to return. When the war ended and Gene Autry returned in 1946, what he faced was not a familiar stage waiting for him, but a world that had already changed in his absence. The voice that had once echoed steadily on Melody Ranch was still there, but the sense of exclusivity was no longer intact. He returned to radio, to film, to the recording studio. He was still the same man with the same voice and the same image, but everything around him had shifted. Audiences still remembered him, but they had also grown accustomed to other faces. Roles still came. Songs were still recorded. But to hold the position he once had, it was no longer enough to simply appear. He had to reclaim attention piece by piece in a market that no longer stood still for anyone. It was under that pressure that another direction gradually took shape, not in front of the camera, but behind it. When the Gene Autry Show went on air in 1950, viewers still saw a familiar cowboy riding, singing, and resolving trouble in a way that frightened no one. But this time, Gene was not just the face of the program. He controlled how it was created, how it operated, and how the profits were retained. With around 91 episodes, the show did more than restore his strong presence on the small screen. It marked a deeper shift. Gene Autry began moving away from being someone hired to perform toward becoming the one who defined the rules of the game. That decision did not stop with a single program. Flying at Productions emerged as the next step, where Gene no longer had to wait for roles from major studios. From there came names like Annie Oakley, the Range Rider, and Buffalo Bill Jr. These projects not only expanded his influence, but proved he could create success for others. A system began to form, one in which Gene was not just part of a story, but the owner of the story itself. His conflicts with Republic Pictures did not disappear. They shifted into another form, quieter but sharper. When his old films began to be broadcast on television without bringing him proportional benefit, Gene responded in the way of someone who fully understood his own value. The lawsuit in the early 1950s was not merely a legal dispute. It was a declaration that he would not accept being reused as an ownerless asset. Although the outcome did not fully favor him, something crucial had already happened. Gene realized that true power did not lie in how many films he appeared in, but in who owned them. Years later, when he was able to regain control of his own film library, the flow of income no longer depended on short-term contracts. By 1953, with Last of the Pony Riders, Gene Autry stepped away from cinema in a way very few stars could. Not because he had been replaced, but because he could see more clearly what lay ahead than what the past could continue to offer. He did not disappear. He simply moved into another position where the spotlight no longer shone directly on him. Yet everything still operated around the decisions he made. On October 7, 1998, Gene Autry passed away at his home in Los Angeles from lymphoma, just days after his 91st birthday. His passing took place in a private space, quiet, without spectacle, without drama, a subdued ending for a life once filled with so much sound. Gene Autry was gone, but his image never left the memory of America. Few people travel such a long path from a boy working in the fields to the position of a cultural icon, then continue to transform that very image into a system that could exist independently. He did not live only in music or film. He existed in the way people imagined an entire era. More than 2 decades on screen, hundreds of songs, hundreds of hours of broadcasting, and countless projects beyond the boundaries of entertainment. These were not merely achievements. They were the traces of a man who understood that talent could open doors, but only discipline and vision could keep them from closing. When Gene Autry sang, people did not just hear a song. They heard a part of themselves, endurance, belief, and even the quiet exhaustion hidden beneath a calm exterior. In film, he did not create a complex cowboy. He created a standard, simple, clear, and strong enough to endure across generations. In music, he did not chase spectacle. He preserved the most familiar emotions, the kind that allows a song to stay with listeners for years without fading. In business, he did not simply earn money from fame. He retained its value, turning it into something that could outlast his own life. The name Gene Autry is not tied to a single moment. It is tied to a way of living, perseverance, discipline, and the constant effort to remain standing even as everything around changes. When one of his songs plays, when the image of a cowboy riding across a vast land appears, people do not just remember an artist. They remember a man who chose to walk his path to the very end without turning aside, without stepping back. Share your thoughts about Gene Autry. What is it that makes you remember him the most? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to continue following stories like this one.